If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
There are 193 member states of the United Nations. Only 14 of them have full equal legal rights for women, according to the World Bank.
No country has achieved full gender equality, and women continue to face discrimination in every region of the world.
Gender equality isn't just a pathway to a better future for women and girls. It can have a positive impact on the whole of society. If we don't have gender equality, we can't fix the climate crisis, we can't build sustainable food systems, deliver peace and security. All the ambitions of the United Nations will not be achieved.
Gender inequality is the overwhelming injustice of our age and the biggest human rights challenge we face.
The UN's fourth World Conference on Women took place in Beijing in September 1995. On the 15th of September, at the end of the conference, the Beijing Platform for Action was agreed. It was the most progressive blueprint ever for advancing women's rights, with governments around the world pledging to change or remove their existing unfair laws and make legal equality a reality. But that goal is far from being realised.
It will take 75 years before women can expect to be paid the same as men for the same work.
In this podcast series, we'll explore why, today, there is still some form of legal inequality that exists in almost every country. We'll hear from people fighting for change today, and also from some of the leading activists from the last 50 years in the equality movement.
The 60s and the 70s were a time of a great this could be different.
And we'll meet people who fought gender inequality whilst holding political office.
The sexism and misogyny grew over time. So the longer I governed, the more there were political issues that were in contest.
We'll find out why we're in this situation and what drives gender inequality, what is its true impact, and what do we need to do to change it and build a better future for women and girls. This is We Change the Rules. So thanks for joining us. I'm Samira Ahmed, and in this episode we're going to start by looking at the current situation of gender inequality around the world. What is the state of inequality for women and girls, and how can we hold governments accountable? Just before we start, though, let's hear from Ayesha Malik, who is the first female judge of the Supreme Court in Pakistan. What does she see as the biggest gender equality issues legally at the moment, both in her own country, Pakistan, and across the world?
One of the biggest gender equality issues is the fact that there is a lack of inclusivity and a lack of participation by women. And that means that there is a lack of a gender perspective in the overall narrative. And this becomes relevant in the Pakistan context, where 49% of the population are women, are underutilized and are not able to pursue their dreams. You have women not visible, not accepted for doing anything other than a culturally given role to them, that is of being a homemaker. So not only do we need to change the mindset, but we also need to ensure that there is a gender perspective in the narrative. Because overall, laws and policies have been made by men, systems have been designed by men, and the gender perspective is definitely missing from this narrative.
Really insightful to hear from Ayesha there. And the issues that she touches on we will explore over the series. But now I want to introduce Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. Phumzile is the former deputy president for South Africa, holding office between 2005 and 2008. In 2013, she was appointed as the executive director for UN Women, so has a very global view of inequality in the law for women and girls and the impact of it. It was fascinating to speak to her from her office in South Africa and look at the impact of gender inequality and where it sits on the international agenda.
Can I ask you to look back over your incredible career? You began as a school teacher, you've served in the South African Parliament, you've held great senior office as a minister and as deputy president. And gender inequality has always been an issue that you've looked at. And I wonder how you feel about how far we've come and where we are now.
We really went through a phase where you could see that we were going forward in the context of South Africa, the end of apartheid and the rebuilding of a new South Africa was a wonderful time. Not easy, but you could make differences and change that you could touch. You had new laws that empowered women. You were putting women in positions of leadership where they could make a difference. You were bringing in young people and young women into places where they had not been. You were addressing positioning of women in jobs that were historically for men. So, it was a very hopeful time. And you saw that there were difficulties, but it was like, we have a way. We will go through this. And then suddenly you saw the change. We began to see the pushback. And of course, when bigger countries begin to lose a direction, we all feel it. When the US turned and we began to see regression in the US, we all felt it. We are seeing the problems on the reproductive rights. In many countries, women are losing their rights. We were moving somewhere on ending child marriage. So now you really have to pick ourselves up and start from the scratch and make sure that we do not erode all of the gains that we had already achieved. One thing that I've learned in this phase of gender equality is that no victories are permanent. You almost have to stay ready to fight all the time. And it has been painful to come to that recognition because you had put so much to get to where we got to.
When you describe the situation with too many things happening at the same time, all of these problems are large, UN Women seems to be logically the right place, the right size institution to try and tackle this. Can I ask what your experience has been being part of it and how far you think it's able to work to tackle some of these huge challenges successfully?
Well, UN Women has been a champion for gender equality within the UN and beyond the UN, because it was also important for UN Women to push the UN itself in all the sectors, because after all, you find gender equality in every sector of society. And since the UN serves different sectors of society, you want everyone who is coming from the UN, wherever they are serving, to champion gender equality as well. And I can't say that we succeeded in all cases, but in areas where you actually had people who also embraced gender equality, you could go a little step further. You could push WHO. It was already a willing horse. They could grasp and run with gender equality themselves. They were very good and strong on violence against women. For instance, it was a good collaboration. You could deal with UNESCO on education, grappling with the issue of access to education for girls and for boys. But of course, you had to deal with the fact that we together as the UN must influence society. The member states come from real countries with real people. And as you know, sometimes countries are so different. There are countries that are causing us the kinds of challenges that you know about on gender equality. We find that there is a pushback in the countries where, for instance, there's religious authority. There's a lot of pushback in countries where there is traditional leadership. So in those countries, you have to work extra hard to end child marriage, for instance. You have to work extra hard against female genital mutilation. You have to work hard for women's representation. It's a very uneven progress, but I must also say that we're able to get a critical mass of women to be at leadership level, helped us to demonstrate how effective women can be. And I am hoping that in this era where we are experiencing so much pushback, the presence of women who have led is going to be very important as role models that should inspire us, because, it's forward ever, backward never. And those role models that you could look up to helps you to rise whenever you fall.
Sadly, as we know in the example of Afghanistan, for example, it has gone backwards, and it had one of the highest proportions of women MPs in the world at one stage. And we've seen that complete rollback of women's rights happen almost overnight. As someone who's held political office, including deputy president in South Africa, is there any substitute for women in political office? You can have all the women you like in NGOs, but is there any substitute for significant numbers of women in political roles?
There isn't. There is no substitute for representation of women in government, where women can make policies and laws that impact everybody. If you have women in the right place, as you would have in political office, it means that you are able to have the interest of women in the heart of the agenda of a country. That is why the Afghanistan issue is so sad. It is also critical to push for women's participation, because in many cases, when you have women in office, they look out for other women. They help to bring in other women. I always say that participation of women in leadership position is one of the most important advancements we can make in gender equality. Ending of violence against women is another important area in which women's progress is needed. And then thirdly, women's economic participation, and I mean effective women participation, is another area that is critical for true empowerment of women to be achieved.
One of the issues I've noticed repeatedly over the years, including in South Africa, is how often women's issues can suddenly be dropped down the agenda. So after the 2008 economic crisis, there was the sense that women's equality isn't as important as getting the economies right. We saw a huge impact on women in the workforce losing work. In South Africa, I remember coming to report on the so-called phenomenon of corrective rape when lesbian women were being attacked. And there was this sense, I remember talking to men about it and saying, well, you're being racist, focusing on this issue in South Africa, that somehow violence against women and issues that affected women could sometimes be seen as distracting from a bigger picture. And I wonder how you view that challenge, that attitude.
Absolutely. And I would say to men, black men, for instance, that the same way you thought that racism was unbearable, and you needed to mobilize everybody, black and white, to fight against racism, gender inequality is also unbearable, equally unbearable. And it needs both men and women to fight against it. It is very dangerous when gender equality is made secondary, because you just have to look at the numbers of women we are leaving behind because of patriarchy. And how strong, patriarchy is so stubborn. And because of that, so many women get left behind. So we have to continuously and without stop, continuously push against patriarchy.
I love the way that you express that. Patriarchy is so stubborn. So when you talk about the impact of UN Women on organizations like UNESCO or the WHO, can you give me an insight into where women's equality sits on that international agenda and how often you do get pushback?
Well, of course, I'm not as involved with international organizations right now. But if I just look across the world, which is full of anti-rights movements, and most of these anti-rights movements always have an angle against women, it means that internationally we have a big challenge. If you just think of reproductive rights, how many countries have moved in the opposite direction on reproductive rights, even when you thought they were moving forward? I think America is a classical example of the push against women. And then when you also think of the impacts of HIV and AIDS, something we don't talk a lot about these days, young women in particular continue to be a key group that needs to be addressed when it comes to the fight against HIV and AIDS. And the sad thing is that if we cannot turn around that group, we are not getting closer to our 2030 targets, because in the 2030 target, we want to stop new infections, but we are increasing on young women. So this is one international phenomena that we still have.
Can you tell me a bit about the Generation Equality Forum and what it aims to achieve?
So Generation Equality is a big mobilization intergenerationally, so that you bring in the youngest woman to the oldest woman. It is a mobilization across genders and across sectors of society. It's managed to bring all of these different stakeholders in one struggle that addresses gender equality somehow in both a qualitative and a quantitative way. It also highlighted the issue of resources and money needed to implement gender equality, because one of the challenges that we have faced in gender equality is just the limited resources that are there for implementing programs that address gender equality. And then we tried to highlight areas that, for instance, were not as highlighted in the Beijing Declaration, because maybe at that time, they were not as central as they are now. Technology, for instance, and innovation was not as strong in Beijing. Climate change was not as strong in Beijing. So that while you continue to deal with the issues that we are bringing with us from the Beijing Declaration, but you are also responding to the issues as they arise now. And it does require a lot of attention, because you're pulling, from so many fronts. It needs dedicated capacity, both at international level, at regional level, and at local level, because in any case, people have to feel the change at a local level. And Generation Equality needs a strong UN woman that can withstand times of pushback against the pushback, of pushback generally against gender equality.
You mentioned the need for dedication, and you spoke earlier about the fact that older women are often particularly discriminated against. And it strikes me there's a generation of women activists like yourself, the politicians in different countries. I think of Harriet Harman in the UK, who've spent a lifetime in the political and the public service arena, working diligently towards gender equality. And right now, we've noticed in many countries, some of this generation of women starting to retire. In some cases, women stepping down because of the level of abuse that they're getting, enabled by social media technology and death threats and so on. We saw the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, for example. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what's needed in terms of motivating younger generations to get engaged in this kind of activism and public service around gender equality, because it can feel sometimes that women are actually being put off entering the arena. And I don't think we thought that would be the case 40 years ago.
Well, I myself am retired. I thought I was coming back to really take it easier, but I am finding myself engaged in so many things. I have to ask myself often, is this what I am still doing? I did this 30 years ago, and the fight needs to be just as intense as it was 30 years ago. But that's the nature of the beast. I cannot afford to stop at this point. So younger women are critical, which is why Generation Equality was so important. It was also a realization that you cannot expect these older women to be the ones that are dominating the fight for gender equality. But also there were young women who are substantive, who want to be involved. Younger women were not asking to be taken care of. They wanted to take care of the agenda themselves. So it has always been important to bring them in. However, we needed many more than the women that we could see coming forward. We needed to mobilize as much as we can. And I don't think that we are succeeding to the extent that we need to and want to. So we really have to work much harder. And as older women, we need to move out of the center stage, because part of what turns away younger women is feel that there is no place for them at leadership level. They need the space to be leaders. But on the other hand, some women are being turned off by the idea that this thing is just too difficult, and they just decide to walk away. So you have tensions on both sides. Those who want to get in and feel that older women are holding the stage, and those who are feeling that this is just too difficult. I also think that the feminists of the coming generation and time cannot be just women. Feminism has to be something that has got both men and women to take matters forward, because you have men who get it, who can play a critical role as allies, who also have to fight for themselves and de-stereotype all the stereotypes that make patriarchy to be so resilient. We need people of all sexual orientation to be parts of this journey and to take us forward.
That was Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka sharing her experiences and showing just how important it is to achieve equality in the law. Of course, talking to Phumzile, you could be forgiven for thinking that gender inequality is something that is more prominent in developing countries. But in this series, we're going to show that this isn't the case and look at how this is an issue that impacts every country in the world. In the United States, for example, a giant of the developed Western world, child marriage under the age of 18, is still legal in the majority of states, and it is a huge issue. Campaigning against this is Freddie Rees, who's the founder of Unchained at Last.
The situation regarding child marriage in the U.S. is pretty grim. Right now, child marriage or marriage before age 18 remains legal in most of the United States. States that have banned child marriage did so only in the last few years, and only because we at Unchained at Last and our allies have been pushing relentlessly for change. Hundreds of thousands of children's lives are being destroyed because of these laws. And in fact, our research showed that between 2000 and 2018, 300,000 children under the age of 18 were entered into marriage in the United States, and at least 60,000 of those marriages occurred with a spousal age difference that should have been considered a sex crime.
The US is one of many countries that we'll talk about in this podcast, about why on April the 27th, 2023, the US Senate fell short of the votes needed to pass an Equal Rights Amendment to enshrine equality for women into their constitution. How can a country that's home to the UN fall down on its basic equality obligations? Mona Sinha is the Global Executive Director of Equality Now, based in New York. And this constitutional issue is one of a series of things I discussed with her.
So, Mona, I wanted to start by asking you, what made you get involved in this field of work of tackling gender and sex inequality?
Well, you know, we all have our personal stories, right? And I grew up in India as the third girl in a family of 3 children. So I often around me would hear people say, oh, it's so sad you don't have a boy in the family who's going to inherit the family property, things like that, which as a child didn't make sense, but was confusing to me, like I was supposed to be something else. And so I often would do things that I thought a boy would do in our family, like play sports, which I was terrible at, but I still did it. So that was sort of my first inkling. And then when I was 12, I used to volunteer at Mother Teresa's home because I grew up in Calcutta in India. And there were lots of girls my age, and it would be great fun to play with them until one day the penny dropped that there were no boys because either they weren't given up for adoption or they were adopted first. And that realization sunk in. So all my life, I've been very aware of this discrepancy between boys and girls and how they're treated. You see all around you how little girls don't eat so that brothers can eat and so forth. So this has stayed with me. And as a grown-up, when I moved to the States and studied at a women's college, I was really supported by women, realized the importance of having gender equality in the world. So it came from a very early age, and I'm still very committed to it and have channeled my whole life into doing this work.
So let's look at where we are now. We're talking about the idea of equality. We've been talking about it for so long. Only 14 countries in the world, according to the World Bank, have full legal equality. And I wonder why that is, and actually what we're talking about when we're talking about full legal equality, Mona.
Full legal equality just means that under the law, women and men have the same rights. And around the world, there are only 75% of the rights that men have that are afforded to women. And I think it's quite simple. If you look at when the laws were designed for our world, and I'm talking about globally, they were written by men for men. Women weren't really considered to be part of the equation. And sadly, even though we've made a lot of progress, there's still a lot of progress to be made. 25% of parliamentarians around the world are women, and that's considered a record. What's a record about having a quarter of representation in the very systems and places that make our laws? So unfortunately, if you don't have women's voices at the table, then our needs and our rights are not amplified. And when this happens, the laws revert back to what they know best, which is being constructed by men for men. And this is not just in the legal framework, frankly, Samira, it's everywhere. In the US, for example, there are only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs that are women. Even in as far as safety testing goes, only in 2022 were automakers testing safety belts and so forth on women models or women's bodies. So these are things that have just been the status quo for a long time, and it's about time that these things were changed.
Could you give an example of a country which has model equality and what is included in that then? Because we know a lot of countries have laws supposedly guaranteeing or enshrining equality in aspects of society. What countries are really doing it?
So the 14 countries include countries like Sweden and Finland and so forth, the Nordic countries, which shouldn't surprise anybody. Most countries who have signed the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, otherwise known as CEDAW, are bound by a certain number of rules and behaviors that monitor the situation of women and promote women's rights. And so that's the goal, right? That's the goal, to have these rights in the constitutions of these countries so that if they are violated for some reason, women have recourse and women have the ability to say, wait, I'm holding you accountable. So these are things, simple things like the right to vote, the right to hold public office, exercise public functions, equal rights for women to represent countries at international levels, political participation, and all of that. But then it goes down to their legal status, which is interesting when it comes down to which countries have signed CEDAW, for example, but have certain holdbacks. And these are mostly around things like marriage, things like equality in the family. Those countries that have successfully executed on these have these rights. Women are equal citizens in the law. Women are equal partners in social norms and social constructs such as marriage and children, caregiving, all of these things that tend to be extra burdens on women, and also have the right to use their voice in public spaces, probably have greater representation on corporate boards, sitting around tables where rules are made for society and for women at large. Because these impact everybody. It's not just that these laws are good for women, they're actually good for everyone because we learn from difference. So we learn from having the multiplicity of voices and opinions in a room. So the more diverse the opinions, the more we can learn from them.
Tell me a bit more about CEDAW, this Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. What's the basis of the reservation some countries have around it? Is it to do with perhaps often religious and cultural ideas about families? Or is it more than that?
Yes, there are about 400 reservations to CEDAW. Most countries in the world have signed it. There are only a few that haven't, and sadly that includes the United States. So the countries that have not ratified or signed CEDAW include the United States, Iran, Sudan, Somalia, Nauru, Palau, and Tonga. So it's an interesting group that the United States belongs in. Of these 400 reservations, over 60% of them are based on religion, as you correctly acknowledged. Article 16, which is on equality in the family, and that's the most reserved of all. In fact, of all UN human rights treaties, not just CEDAW. So that's very interesting to know. So these are laws, or these are reservations against equality in the family, which is an area that equality now works in as well.
Do you think if the United States had the Equal Rights Amendment, it would have made ratifying and implementing CEDAW easier?
Oh, absolutely. The United States does not have the Equal Rights Amendment in its constitution. And if it did have it, then we could hold the U.S. accountable to ratifying CEDAW and making sure that women have equal representation and equal rights under the law. I mean, the ERA is a very simple statement. It just says that this amendment prohibits discrimination based on sex. So it's actually not even just about women alone. It's for everybody. It's for men. It's for non-binary individuals. It's for transgender people. It's for any human being that's protected under the Constitution.
Specifically on the US, because it's such a big player, everyone looks to see what the US is doing. How do you assess where the United States is right now in terms of the ERA and its attitude to the issues of equality for women?
Well, it's funny. I think this is a situation where the United States has slipped significantly on a world stage as being a leader for human rights, specifically for women's rights. The ERA has actually been ratified by all 38 states, which is a constitutional requirement. What is holding the adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution is a small thing that was put in the preamble to the ERA that had an artificial time limit. And that time limit is what creating the problem with it being put into the Constitution. That needs to be removed. Interestingly, there has been a huge uptick in supporting the ERA and recognizing the importance of it in the last administration, where women's rights were severely curtailed and moved back. And so there's actually now a caucus in the Senate that represents the ERA. So there is progress being made, but it's slow.
People talk about, and you've done it yourself, talk about how giving sexual equality would help everybody. And I know one of the issues people talk about a lot is how climate change impacts women significantly more than men. How could sexual and gender equality help find wider global solutions?
I see a lot of these issues in our world as being how it's framed. So climate change is framed as an environmental problem. But actually, it's much more than an environmental problem. It's what I call a threat multiplier, because it interacts with social systems to really further exacerbate systemic inequalities. So, for example, everyone is affected by the ravages of climate change. The vulnerability of women, depending on where they are placed, their class, ethnicity, age, is much more impacted. So I'll give you an example in Malawi, for example. In climate change in Malawi is putting women and girls at a much greater risk of sexual and gender-based violence. About 9 out of 10 people depend on rain-fed agriculture. A third of the country's population, about 5 million out of 16 million, are on the brink of extreme hunger. And rising temperatures, rains, extreme weather conditions like cyclones are just damaging their ability to produce food. I mean, this is just very basic stuff, and it's driving up costs. Also the economic downturn of the COVID crisis has disrupted the global supply chain everywhere. The ability of farmers to get seeds, the cost of fertilizers, they've pushed prices up. And this is a real big problem in Malawi because 82% of their population lives in rural areas. Women actually account for over 65% of smallholder farmers, so they're particularly exposed to this food insecurity, and they depend on natural resources. So they can no longer earn a living in this sector, leaving them less able to withstand economic shocks, let alone environmental shocks that are causing them.
You mentioned that it places women at greater risk of violence too. How did you mean?
Absolutely. If you think about now with water scarcity, with rainfalls becoming less predictable, women have to walk longer and longer stretches to get water. On their way back from these journeys, we know women are often sexually exploited, punished at home because it takes them longer to carry out their daily chores, cook food for the family, because just doing these basic everyday needs just takes much longer and exposes them to much more dangerous terrain.
You talk a lot at Equality Now about why the law is the basis for gender equality. Why is it the law that's so essential when we've seen in other countries, I mean, in Britain, for example, where there are laws about equality, for example, in pay, doesn't mean that it happens. Why is the law the focus for your work?
Well, I feel like the law is the fundamental brick and mortar of having an accountability system. If you don't have a law, how do you challenge the discrimination that you face? And I'll give you an example. So women in countries that don't have equal rights to inheritance and property, for example, if you take that and connect that to climate change, and you take the law, it shows that when you don't have a law that allows women to own property, in 100 out of 189 countries in the world, in 36 of them, widows are not granted the same inheritance rights as widowers. Daughters can't inherit the same proportion of assets. And so they have no recourse. All of a sudden, they're left to whatever handouts they get from the male members of the family. Often they are mistreated. And this is a really big problem for the world. And I think this is where the law has to be implicitly available for people to get access to what they rightly deserve.
Can I ask how optimistic you are? I mean, you look at some issues, like, for example, Roe versus Wade in the United States, where it feels the clock's being turned backwards on rights that were hard won. How optimistic are you about the battle that Equality Now is fighting?
Well, we have to be optimistic. Otherwise, how could we be doing this work, right? I truly believe that we are at a situation where, at least during the COVID pandemic, women's voices were being elevated. The issues framing women's real lives were being elevated. But I think we need to keep the pressure up to talk about women's lived experiences and why, frankly, equality in the law for women helps everybody, helps communities, helps men, helps young boys and girls and everybody around the world to live their best lives. So it is extremely important and it is extremely valuable for us to focus on this.
One question always intrigues me when I talk to people who are leaders about equality for women, and it's looking at the supposed idea of the market being the solution. Mm-hmm. You have a kind of great corporate background yourself in different companies, including Elizabeth Arden.
Yeah.
And I remember in China, we know that historically there was this terrible gender imbalance because of female fetuses being aborted in the one-child era. And you'd think, by market logic, that there would come a point with this imbalance that women would be hugely valuable in society because there weren't enough of them to go around. Actually, what happened was there was a growth in kidnapping and trafficking and more violence and abuse of women rather than women being valued because of their scarcity. Do you have a view about how far, dare I say it, market solutions are any use in thinking about sexual equality?
Well, that's a very interesting example, isn't it? It just confirms that the majority, which in this case were men, get to set the standards, and that the social norms in this case were really messed up because there weren't enough women that are amplifying family values or community values and so forth. So it was much more kind of the aggressive patriarchal systems that were leading to, we need to hoard this because it's scarce. And so we will traffic women so that we can use them, or we will kidnap brides so we can marry them because there are not enough of them around. You know what I mean? So it's sort of coming from that scarcity model as a solution set, which is never effective. So I think from a market perspective, decisions can be made from learning from everybody. So an example I use sometimes is transparency is what the market hopes to bring. It's transactional. There's a supply, there's a demand, there's an economic incentive, and so the market works efficiently. So for example, if there had been transparency at Goldman Sachs, for example, about equality, then they wouldn't have been sued by 2,800 women, and they would have saved $215 million that they had to pay out in damages. That is a very effective market-based example of how equality could have saved them a couple of pennies, I think.
Another interesting question is the political reality of international diplomacy around women's rights. So you have countries like Saudi Arabia, which market themselves as making progress in certain areas. They're sitting on a human rights committee at the UN, and yet we know that the rights of women are pretty low in the pecking order compared to other countries in the world. How do you regard this dilemma of countries needing to be included in the conversation and yet being at the heart of the problem when it comes to gender equality?
The problem is if they're not included in the conversation, there is no way for them to learn about why it's important. I understand where Saudi Arabia comes from and its extremely patriarchal system, but I do think they are starting to see women's engagement in the economy and in different parts of just daily life that is valuable to them. If you kick them out of the conversation, they can become North Korea. There is no reason for them to respond. There is no incentive for them to change. There is no ability for other national governments to put any kind of pressure on them to make progress. There is no way for women within the country to find solidarity with other groups of women around the world to champion their own cause. So I think leaving people out of the conversation is never a good strategy.
Can I ask a bit about funding all this work? People look, for example, at climate action, which, as you've pointed out, predominantly affects women and girls. How far is getting adequate funding for the issues that you need to tackle a problem?
You have hit the nail on the head. This is the key issue that we are dealing with, especially in our sector. I think this whole sector functions from a place of scarcity just because there aren't enough resources to tackle this issue. From a government side, only 1% of quote-unquote gender equality funding from governments flows to women's organizations, and just 3% of environmental philanthropic funding goes to women's environmental activism. Just in philanthropy in general, it's 1.9% of the billions and billions of philanthropic dollars that are out there that flow into women's and girls' rights work. So it's really unsecure and insecure because we know that securing women's rights isn't just the right thing to do. It's the best way to build a resilient, inclusive, and livable future for everyone. Yet the dollars don't go to it. So there is some reframing that we need to do to make this an economic imperative.
Fabulous, Mona. Thank you so much.
The highest percentage of unemployed are women. The poorest of the poor are women. The social marginalized and excluded are women.
I'm Samira Ahmed, and this is We Change the Rules, a podcast from Equality Now. Thanks again to Mona Sinha for her view on the current state of gender inequality in the law and the picture in the US. So we've looked at what's going on, what the current state of gender inequality is around the world. In the next episode, we're going to find out how we got here, what happened to drive gender inequality.
A system of treatment, even in the law, developed where they were looked upon with no rights.
Please do download and listen when you can.